Okay, this is a personal perspective based on research into politics, psychology, and history that I've done personally. My goal is not to convince you that alternative voting methods produce better representation of individual preference, though they do. I hope instead to get people thinking about what voting feels like and the possible effects of that. Research and history show that this is one of the most politically divided periods of the last 100 years, and the strong representation in recent election cycles of Bernie or bust and Never Trumpers shows that this is not merely a two-party divide, yet our election system is only capable of representing a binary choice. We know from the study of priming that the context and environment in which we make our decisions can have a dramatic effect on our choices and behaviors. If people can, in practice, only be either Republican or Democrat at the ballot box, they are likely to align themselves more with one of those identities. Yet it's clear that this is a misrepresentation of their real beliefs. A majority of voters now identify as independent. This creates cognitive dissonance, contributing to voter dissatisfaction, distrust, and unease, and simultaneously and paradoxically increasing rigidity and defense of the conflicted voter identity. We are all well aware of the potential and actual harms of polarization, especially with the events of the past year. Extremism leads to violence, especially against minorities. Government changes hands and swings wildly one direction or the other in policy and action. The polarization perpetuates itself. There are many options to look at for improving our electoral process, including electoral college reform, campaign finance, gerrymandering reform, but the effects are sometimes unclear and unintuitive, and most of them face significant challenges to implementation. Voting method reform has some potential advantages here. There are several benefits to focusing on how we vote. Reforms can be implemented at any level of government at any time, and there are several existing examples in the US to learn from. They might even be a stepping stone to proportional representation, which would further increase fairness. There are numerous alternative voting methods that provide better ways to express complex voter preference. I won't go into the definition of each here, but the names may be helpful moving forward. There is plurality, the current US system, ranked choice or IRV, score voting, approval, Borda, Condorcet, and others. Ranked choice may be familiar to many of you, especially if you're from the Bay Area, where it is used in Oakland, San Francisco, Berkeley, and San Leandro. It currently has the broadest US awareness and actual use. Despite this fact, and although it has several benefits, it is not necessarily the best option. Other methods, such as score or approval voting, also naturally have pros and cons. There are detailed theoretical and mathematical breakdowns of how one may fare versus another, and I'll provide websites where you can visually explore their results. But the goal of all of them is improvement, and we should not expect perfection from any one approach. In the graph here, you can see various voting methods compared on two criteria. The degree of simplicity is on the vertical axis with greater simplicity at the top, and the horizontal axis shows group satisfaction with the outcomes where greater satisfaction is to the right. Although IRV, Condorcet, and others have wide ranges of potential satisfaction, with the exception of the very worst possible performance of those methods, they are all superior to plurality, which is our current system. Even in the worst case, they're essentially equivalent to plurality. So there are numerous benefits to alternative voting methods. Plurality voting doesn't allow the majority independent US electorate to express their true choices. Ranked choice voting and others can increase decisiveness of electoral outcomes, provide more opportunities for third parties, and potentially increase voter turnout. With voters able to express support for multiple candidates, we should also get more detailed and accurate info about what people actually want. This in turn can help normalize diversity of opinion. Even if diversity of elected candidates doesn't significantly increase, there may also be psychological benefits in the short and the long term. We're also increasingly aware of how important authenticity and representation are to psychological well-being. Imagine how your life as a whole might be limited if you could only ever say yes or no. Political opinions can be complex, for example, economically conservative but socially liberal. And while the outcome of elections is very important, our trust in and experience of the process is also critical. My hope is that we can change not just who we elect, but how we feel about voting. Feeling good about our electoral process can fundamentally change how we relate to voting and to other voters, and even those we disagree with. There is promising initial research on the effects of non-plurality voting, which appears to show that election civility, candidate satisfaction, and even minority and gender representation increase with RCV and likely other methods for the same reasons. But more research and testing are needed. Clearly, our current system is broken in various ways. Given the last two election cycles and the greater shifts towards polarization of the last 80 years, different has a good chance of being better, as long as our reforms are well considered and we remain open to adjustment. Politics can be messy, and it seems it will forever be in flux, a never-ending process of improvement without reaching perfection. Within that context, alternative voting methods are a key reform, offering lower barriers to implementation and already showing evidence of increased voter turnout and satisfaction and decreased polarization despite so far limited implementation. We can implement it at multiple levels of government and with numerous alternative methods, all offering advantages over plurality. In the end, breaking out of the rigidity of the US political process and prioritizing experience as much as outcomes may in itself be the most important thing.
again.
It crashed again, but apparently it's still working.
Wait, do you have the screen sharing crashed?
Yeah.
You're with us.
Okay, cool. That's so weird. I've never had that happen with Zoom before, but anyway. Cool.
It's the end of the school year and it's a school account. It's, it's done. It's
That
done.
must be it. I'm sure that's it.
To start with questions, actually, I want to ask you something about one of the most extreme things that I've read about or heard about lately, which is what kind of research has been done about lottery governing, just completely choosing representatives by lottery.
That's an interesting question. Actually, on that slide that I showed you with the graph, I guess I could reshare it again. I'm a little worried because it's
in the top left.
Okay. So random winner, which I think kind of addresses your question, is at all the way, it's maximal simplicity, but it's also the least amount of satisfaction. Yeah.
But that's for one race, right, as opposed to choosing a panel of a bunch of representatives.
Yes. So that kind of gets at something I didn't have time to talk about, which is that different voting methods have different consequences, whether you have a single winner or whether you're electing multiple people to a board or something like that. And the consequences can vary a lot. Obviously, the more people that you add to it, the more complex the whole thing gets to predict and evaluate and all of that sort of thing. Proportional representation, in my view, is sort of the best way to handle, if you have like a 10-member committee or something that you're electing for. Randomness, I don't know. I think that would be low satisfaction, but I don't know. I guess more specifically addressing your question, I'm not aware of much research that's been done towards that. I think it's sort of like the intuitive anti-approach or something like that. Like whatever you do, don't go random. But I'm also a little bit of a maverick in the sense of like, well, are we sure though? We should study this craziness and see if our intuition is right.
Okay, I see Jamie waiting with a question now.
Thanks. Yeah, I find all this stuff incredibly fascinating, and I'm guessing one of the links that you're probably going to share is the CGP Grey videos on YouTube. I think that's how I first got introduced to it. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about is about the complexity piece of it. So I know that there are a lot of systems that are, ostensibly give you a better result or generally give you a better result, but I'm curious if you know about how they've been received in terms of people's understanding of them. Yes. I think the first past the post, for all its flaws, does have a certain simplicity to it. But I wonder, what have you learned about Maine and wherever else have put this into place? I'm really interested.
Yeah, so this connects with what I said about ranked choice voting being the most popular, but not necessarily the best. Ranked choice is a little confusing for people. It has problems like ballot spoilage, where someone can, if they accidentally rank the two candidates the same, then their ballot gets entirely thrown out, et cetera. This is one reason why more recently I have tended to favor score voting, which is sort of like basically rating something on Yelp or Amazon. It's just 5 stars, 10 points, whatever, right? And you can assign as many points as you want within the scale to any candidate. So if you assign 10 points to 2 people, no spoilage, whatever. And it's very intuitive, I think, especially in modern times, because we're used to rating things on a scale and whatever. There's no perfect system. There's definitely, confusion around that. But yeah, again, I will say that ranked choice voting has momentum, and so that's one reason to potentially support it, but it is not the most intuitive system. It does have some concerns around that. And some of the research that is a little bit, how do I put it, conflicting. So there's research that says there's greater voter turnout, and there's some research that suggests somewhat the opposite, or that there's some resistance, and some of that appears to tie into complexity, not understanding the system, not understanding how to vote effectively or whatever. I'll also just briefly mention that some systems, like this connects with one point I'll make real briefly. Australia has a system where they use ranked choice voting, they require you to rank all the candidates, which is a terrible, terrible requirement to have, because sometimes they have over 100 candidates. So they then have an alternative where you can basically vote a fixed ballot that has been prepared by a party. And so, yeah, it kind of like screws up the whole RCV system, right? But the reason I make this point is that education and outreach are just so critical to any new system you're going to implement. No matter how simple, education and outreach are vital. And I think that in some cases that has fallen down a bit in implementations of RCV as well.
Okay, we have time for one or two more.
Yeah, question here.
Go.
Yeah, you mentioned a bunch of really cool ones: board account, Cordyceps, STV, obviously. I don't know much about those. I can Google them, but I was wondering if you could explain if you happen to like one of them, if among the multiple ones you think one is underrated.
Oh, I mean, I think SCORE might be and I had mentioned before that is sort of my current favorite. It might be one of the more underrated ones. Borda and some of the others, they have some, deeper historical basis and theoretical basis, but they're in practice complex for the voter and or complex for evaluation. SCORE happens to be really good in a number of ways. For one thing, it works with existing voting systems for the most part, whereas ranked choice doesn't necessarily, and lots of these other systems don't. So it works with existing systems. As I just described, it seems fairly intuitive, although obviously you still want to educate and all of that kind of stuff. And as far as the various sort of like proofs of insufficiency or something, Arrow's theorem and these other mathematical proofs that demonstrate problems with voting systems, and there's tons of writing about this, but as far as those demonstrations go, depending on how you pick your criteria, SCORE voting scores very well versus ranked choice voting, for example, which they talk about a term called monotonicity and as I said, Arrow's theorem and stuff like that. And they're all basically these different ways of saying, well, if you have three candidates, A, B, and C, and can a pairwise vote between any two candidates then match up with the results of this voting method? So that's one way of evaluating. But anyways, a whole bunch of different ones. But I think SCORE voting comes out well on most of those, especially if you pick the criteria, not just in a sort of like theoretical, well, it should be able to do this, but like, what is the actual consequence of this to define the criteria that you're measuring against, if that makes sense. Yeah. But it hasn't been implemented in any election, any major political elections that I'm aware of. It's used in other contexts, educational contexts and other things like that. But as far as actual like politics somewhere, I'm not aware of it.
All right. Thanks for the questions. That's about all the time.